How did the Pulaski Franciscan province come into existence? Here's how Father Fulgence Messiac described it in a 1950 radio interview.
Then because Mr. Huff was a businessman who knew that whenever there was a church in the community of Poles, that community would grow rapidly, he advertised in Chicago and Milwaukee papers and also in papers further east for a religious community to come to this community of Pulaski.
How long ago was this?
This is exactly 67 years ago. 67 to 70. At any rate, he offered an inducement of 120 acres free to any community that would come to Pulaski and establish a church. And our founder, Brother Augustine Zeytz, was enticed by that inducement, and he came to Pulaski and then decided to build, first of all, a monastery, then to build a church, and in that way to give the foundation for our present very thriving community.
Father Fulgence makes it sound so simple. J.J. Hoff wanted churches in his Polish colonies as an attraction for settlers. He advertised in a variety of locations, and Brother Augustine answered the ad, just like buying a car on Craigslist. Let's take a closer look. Who was Brother Augustine Zeytz? Julius Zeytz was born into a turbulent Poland in 1828. He was a toddler when an uprising, variously known as the Cadet Revolution, the November Uprising, or the Polish-Russian War, brought war and repression to the Congress Kingdom of Poland in the Russian-ruled sector where he lived. As a schoolboy, he would have enjoyed the relative liberalization that took place in the early 1840s. Then, 1848 brought a more revolution and rebellion across Europe. This painting by Wojciech Kosok depicts Polish insurgents skirmishing with Russian cuirassiers on a bridge in Warsaw's Łasienki Park. Polish peasants joined in this time, but the rebellion was short-lived and brutally repressed. Peasants who participated were imprisoned, tortured, and doused with acid to cause disfigurement. It must have been a formative experience for a young man entering adulthood at the age of 20. Nevertheless, Julius acquired an education. The Franciscan history says that he was educated in medicine and philosophy. In those days, philosophy generally meant math and physics, not Socrates, Nietzsche, or Schopenhauer. The failed 1848 uprising had its consequences. There was a shift in popular feeling among German citizens from the policies of liberalization that were in evidence in the 1840s. Prussian and Russian administrators kept trying to crack down on Poles, but were restrained by the judiciary. Judges in the 1850s weren't yet ready to bring down the iron hand of repression, and their restraint led to a more conciliatory policy for the short term. The Prussian judiciary scrupulously defended the use of Polish as an administrative language and in elementary education. Nevertheless, the 1850s were marked by increasing hostility to Poles. Otto von Bismarck, future chancellor of the newly unified Germany, privately advocated exterminating the Poles. But publicly, he pursued a relatively conciliatory policy. With their national identity under attack, Poles looked to the Catholic Church as a reservoir of Polish culture and traditions. Seen in this light, it seems probable that when 33-year-old Julius Zeytz joined the Franciscans in 1861 as a monk, it was as much a political act as a religious act. Then, in 1864, Germanization policies decreed that the monastery could only exist as long as it had more than 7 members. 11 years later, in 1872, the monastery was disbanded by state decree and its property was confiscated. Brother Augustine, as the procurator, was responsible for tending to the monastery's finances. He knew of secret accounts maintained by the monastery that were not in the monastery's name. If the authorities discovered this, he would have been imprisoned. Further, restrictions placed on priests, monks, and nuns made life for them very much like being in prison. This was not well suited to Zeytz's energetic personality. He left for America on November 4, 1872. He arrived in New York at the age of 44. Within a year, he had moved to Shenandoah, Pennsylvania, where he supported himself as a mine worker. He also taught catechism, led Sunday services, used his medical training to treat the immigrants who were in need, and translated news articles from German to Polish and Lithuanian. Undoubtedly, he became aware of the possibilities that America's freedoms opened up. Fluent in German, Polish, and Lithuanian, he also learned English and became a naturalized citizen. He met a Franciscan priest who dreamed of starting a Polish Franciscan community in the United States to minister to immigrants. The idea caught Brother Augustine's imagination. He began to take steps to make it a reality. He began a letter-writing campaign. He wrote to priests in Europe. He wrote to the Franciscan General Curia in Rome. He wrote to monastery provincials in Polish Germany. He met little success, though, because there was a clergy shortage in Europe. There were also reports in American newspapers of anti-Catholicism. Priests feared that a lack of acceptance by the community would compromise their authority, and European provinces were reluctant to assign priests to communities in the United States. After about 10 years in Pennsylvania, in about 1882, Brother Augustine returned to monastic life in Europe. Why did he go back to Europe? Perhaps it was because he thought that he would be in a better position to petition the hierarchy to support his dream of a Polish-American religious community if he was a monk in a European monastery instead of a mine worker in Pennsylvania. Or maybe he thought that after 10 years he would no longer be prosecuted for his handling of the monastery finances. Besides that, life as a monk in Europe would not be as taxing as life in the Pennsylvania coal mines. His superiors in Krakow appointed him procurator and made him an instructor of novices. Nevertheless, he continued his letter-writing campaign, writing to numerous priests and to Rome, outlining the advantages of establishing a Franciscan monastery in America. He wrote to future Pulaski pastors, Father Erasmus Sobocinski, Father Stanislaus Jaka, and Father Jerome Schneider, requesting and urging them to become part of his American Franciscan province. His petition to Rome explained the need to minister to Poles in America and sought permission to establish a Polish Franciscan community. Additionally, he wrote to the Minister General of Franciscans in Rome requesting permission to go back to America and requesting that priests be assigned to his proposed American province. He corresponded with a variety of land agents in New York, Pennsylvania, and elsewhere, including J.J. Hoff in Pulaski, soliciting donations of land to establish a monastery. He contacted architects to secure designs for a monastery and church. Mr. Hoff must have been disposed in 1886 and 1887 to to cultivate a Polish-Lithuanian monk with a vision of a Franciscan community in Pulaski. The settlers had recently been devastated by the 1886 fire. 50,000 board feet of lumber that had been donated for church construction in Pulaski was incinerated, along with 5 million board feet of standing timber. A grand gesture, such as donating land to Brother Augustine, must have done a lot to raise sagging morale. By 1887, Brother Augustine had secured permission from the Franciscan headquarters and the General Curia in Rome to start a Polish-American Franciscan community. He had an architect draw plans for a church and 30-room monastery. This photo, from 1903, was taken at a confirmation ceremony at which the bishop officiated. The U-shaped complex faced St. Augustine Street, known in those days as Hoff's Road. The dormitory for priests and friars is on the left. Brother Augustine's enthusiastic letters had attracted 3 priests. Father Erasmus Sobocinski and Father Stanislaus Jaka arrived in Pulaski in April 1888 after a 25-day journey from Europe. The first 10 years were quite tumultuous. Despite Brother Augustine's glowing, enthusiastic description of the community, when Fathers Erasmus and Stanislaus arrived in April 1888, the 30-room monastery was under construction, but only a skeleton that barely had a roof had been erected. Further, the property was little more than a clearing in the wilderness and was inundated by water. April was the season of the spring thaw, and much of the property was a swampy floodplain that a small creek flows through. This photo shows a spring flooding across the road from the Franciscan property, perhaps a quarter-mile east of the monastery building. The man on the right is my father, Norbert Peplinski, who I'm estimating was 14 years old at the time. Here are photos of Father Erasmus and Father Stanislaus. With no source of income in Pulaski, Bishop Castor assigned these priests parish duty at St. Francis Parish in Polonia, near Stevens Point. Father Erasmus would journey to Pulaski to officiate at weekend masses. Father Jerome Schneider arrived in August of 1888. On the bishop's orders, 2 of the fathers served other parishes, while Father Jerome Schneider embarked on a fundraising missionary tour through 5 states. Pulaski was without a resident priest. However, young Franciscan brothers from Poland had also joined the community. By 1889, the church was not yet complete, and the parish was $9,000 in debt. Adjusting for inflation, that's over $300,000 in 2024. Upon his return from the 5-state fundraising mission tour, the overworked and exhausted Father Jerome's authoritarian demands prompted Brother Augustine and the 9 religious who had joined the community to request and be granted transfers. Left alone to minister to 2 parishes, to oversee the construction of the church and monastery, and to raise funds to service the parish's growing debt, sparks were bound to fly, and they did. There was a lawsuit with the architect. There were disgruntled parishioners who objected to Father Jerome's inflicting corporal punishment on schoolboys. Things got so bad that there was talk in the village of crucifying the priests. At one point, The bishop closed the church in Pulaski due to dissent and turmoil among the friars. Here's a recap of the events in the decade from 1887 to 1897. As the community approached its 10-year anniversary, a contractual provision from Hoff's donation brought everyone together again. The parish needed to be in existence for 10 years or the land would revert to J.J. Hoff. The possible loss of the 120-acre land grant would have been a powerful incentive to put disagreements aside so as to preserve the community. Brother Augustine was a remarkable man. His vision, perseverance, and dedication to his dream brought the Pulaski Franciscan Community into existence. As I look back to the origins of this community, I see a man dedicated to a ministry of service. He provided medical care. He translated news articles for immigrants. He led fellow Catholics in worship service. He used his literary skills to write letters for uneducated community members. At one point, the parishioners petitioned the Curia in Rome to ordain him a priest. That request came to nothing. Perhaps the Curia recognized that he lacked the forceful personality that was required of the priests of the era. Fundraising and church building required a more dynamic personality. It demanded a man who could unite the nationalistic and religious sentiments of Polish immigrants and urge them to sacrifice for the common good. Even a man who could drive them remorselessly to overcome impossible odds to pursue a seemingly unreachable goal. Another man's forceful demeanor and commanding presence was equally responsible for its growth and success through those early years. That would be Father Jerome Schneider. The available historical documents portray quite a different individual from Brother Augustine. Brother Augustine was beloved by all. Father Jerome was unpopular and even despised by some. Brother Augustine devoted his life to serving his fellow Poles, ministering to their physical and spiritual needs. Father Jerome was a hard-driving leader who made things happen. He demanded hard work and obedience of the lay brothers at the monastery. He demanded financial support and loyalty from the parishioners. Under his leadership and pastors who followed him, the parish became an educational center, building a parochial school for local children and founding St. Bonaventure College to train young men for the priesthood. Undoubtedly, a Catholic church and monastery drew people to the area. By 1905, the original church was too small to serve the growing congregation. The foundation was laid for the present church in 1906. The grandiose plan involved laying the foundation for the huge basilica-style church, then using that space for temporary worship until funds permitted raising the upper portion with its 135-foot twin steeples. The original church was torn down and the lumber used to put a roof on the new foundation. It took almost 25 years for the church in its present form to be completed, but it was dedicated in 1931. Here is the construction timeline. In 1906, the foundation was laid. It was then covered with a temporary roof, and that space housed services until 1923. By that time, the parish had raised $60,000, and parishioners started to build the new basilica-style church. In fall, when farm work was lighter, as many as 100 men and boys of the parish came to help raise the walls. After spending the $60,000 in savings and an additional $80,000 in borrowed funds, construction paused. By 1930, the parish had reduced the debt to $35,000. Construction resumed, and in 1931, the twin 135-foot steeples were completed. The parish had $65,000 in debt. Today, the ABVM Church and School dominate downtown Pulaski, but the Franciscan community has fallen on hard times. There are no young Polish men emigrating from Poland for a life of prayer and service as lay brothers in the monastery. The thriving publishing business that began in 1905 has vanished, and the buildings that once covered the 120-acre plot housing St. Bonaventure's College, providing lodging for the lay brothers and priests, and hosting a publishing empire have either been torn down or sold to developers. In a recent letter to parishioners published in the parish bulletin, Father Jim Gannon pointed out that the community numbered 500 in its heyday, but now has only 80 members. Many of these priests and brothers are elderly. Still, the church remains an architectural centerpiece of Pulaski, and the Franciscans of the Pulaski province proudly serve their now more cosmopolitan community in the tradition of Polish Catholicism.